Our scripture passage today is from 1 Kings chapter 17. I'm starting at verse 1. It says this: Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? The Tishbite from Tishbe, said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Some time later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to provide you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town's gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, And bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make yourself something for you and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. So she went away and did as Elijah had told her. And there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Okay. Let's break this down a bit, all right? So Elijah's a man of God who was obedient to God. King Ahab, the ruler, and his wife Jezebel are wicked, sinful rulers over Israel. And in their reign, the country has turned from the worship of Jehovah to the worship of idols. In fact, Jezebel has gone on this tear of killing all the prophets of God and taking all that they wanted without care of who it belonged to, okay? In this reign of evil and terror, God speaks to Elijah to go to the king and pronounce God's judgment on him in the form of a drought in the land. So Elijah shows up at the palace and tells the king that God will withhold the rain from the land until he saw fit to change it. Okay, just remember now, it is not Elijah pronouncing the judgment, okay? He is just a representative of God. And you know, it's funny, isn't it? So often, so many times, we shoot the messenger. I can't tell you how many times people have been angry with me simply for having to call them out on what God's word says and what they're doing, right? So Ahab does exactly that. He gets pretty angry at the messenger, and so he puts a price out on Elijah's head. And because of this, now Elijah has to run for his life. So God puts him in hiding. God directs Elijah to the Kerith Brook, about 50 miles east of the palace. He gets there, and then for the next 6 months or so, God provides for Elijah by having ravens bring him bread and meat, and he got water from the brook, right? So ravens are bringing bread and meat. He's getting water from the brook. And I want to stop there for a moment, and I want to just kind of peel this apart just a little bit. I want you to think about this with me, and I want us to really, sometimes we make Bible stories so antiseptic. I want to make it real, okay? Now listen. Elijah is obedient to God, right? And he did a godly and courageous thing. He was obedient to God, and he went before the wicked, evil king and spoke the word of the Lord to this intolerant king. And he spoke up God's truth in an intolerant and evil culture. Man, way to go, right? Woo! That's the kind of stuff we're looking for. And here's what's the result, right? Was it a ticker tape parade? The king was like, oh my goodness, thank you so much. And the king's like, I'm so glad you spoke up. Can I offer you some wealth and a position in my government? No. The king wanted to cancel him. Elijah has to run for his life. He has to go into hiding, and he has to live in solitude, fearing for his life. You know, remember what we talked about last week, right? In times like these, we have no need to fear. When it seems like everything is against you, we have no need to fear because God is with us. And God was with Elijah. Even though he is walking through the valley of the shadow of death, he will have no fear because God is with him. You know, one of the biggest lessons that God has been teaching me these days is to live in faith one step at a time. One step at a time. And this story has been pivotal in this journey for me in this moment. It's been such a pivotal lesson for me. You know, I want you to notice that God tells Elijah what to do, and only after Elijah does that, that the next step is revealed. God says, go and speak to the king. Elijah does that. Then God says, oh, you spoke to the king. Awesome job. Now go and hide because you spoke to the king. And Elijah was like, okay, sure, I'll do it. Then God says, all right, go to Kerith. So he goes. Then God says, stop at this brook. You're going to be on a camping adventure for a bit. Okay, God, I can do that, but for how long? And God says, well, you'll know when the time comes when it's time to move on, right? So I got a question for you. Do you think that if Elijah had known the full outcome of his obedience to God, he would have done what God had required of him? I'm thinking no. Because Elijah was prone to self-pity and discouragement. If you look through the rest of his life story, you'll see that a lot of times he said, poor me, poor me. So God gave him only what he needed to know for the next moment. And honestly, that is what he has to do with all of us. God doesn't reveal what happens next until we take the first step, and he doesn't give us the whole plan because it will overwhelm us. So Elijah, he puts one foot in front of the other and obeys God. Not knowing much of the details, but knowing that God has spoken and that no word from God is without the inherent power to accomplish it. And God provides food and water for him. He provides the necessities for living. And I want you to notice something, right? In God providing food and water, that God does the provision both naturally and supernaturally. Think about it. He provides supernaturally by bringing Elijah bread and meat morning and evening by ravens. Come on. That's crazy. And kind of unorthodox, don't you think? I mean, if you really think about it, the ravens are birds of prey, so why would they want to bring their meat and bread for Elijah unless it was a supernatural thing, an act of God? The other thing I think is interesting about this particular way that God chose to provide is that the ravens were considered unclean by the Jewish people. And yet still, here it is, God's using the ravens to bring him meat and bread, morning and evening. You know what, can I just tell you something real quick here? That God will use whomever and whatever he wills to do his will. God will use whomever and whatever he wills to do his will. And you and I are not to look down our noses at who or what God chooses to use. All we need to do is thank him for it and eat. And I wonder how many of us are missing the blessings of God because we are despising the vessel God is using. We are discounting the vessel that God is using. God can't use them. God can't use that. God can, we have all these ideas of what God can or cannot use. And we're missing the blessings of God. We're missing the feast that he has for us because we're despising the way and the method that God is using to give it to us. And listen, I don't want you to miss this important word that God told him. He says, listen, I want you to go to the Kerith Brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. Listen, the only place he was going to get fed was in the center of God's will. The food, the miracle was at Kerith. He would only get it if he obeyed God and went to Kerith. And I think so many of us are stuck because we're not willing to even take the first step of obedience that God has directed us to take. God says, put me first. I can't. I don't have the time. God says, go speak to your neighbor. And you're like, oh, I'm scared. I don't like them. God didn't ask you if you liked them or not. He didn't ask you if you were scared or not. He directed you to take a step, and when you do, the next part's going to be revealed, right? And I wonder if you're not experiencing the miraculous power of God in your life because you are not being obedient to the first step. You are going on your own journey instead of following God's direction. Or you want all the directions at once before you can take your first step. Anyway. back to the desert. All alone, there he is. God provides meat and bread for Elijah supernaturally. But then, God also provides naturally for Elijah. He leads him to a brook where Elijah has water, okay? And I want you to stop and think about that for just a moment. You know, it's important that you catch that God didn't lead him to a river that was just rushing river with lots of water. He brought him to a brook. You would think, honestly, I mean, come on. I know that somebody's going to feel it with me when I say this. You would think that if you and I are being obedient to God and you then had to run for your life because of your obedience, then your reward would be increased provision from God, right? Instead of hiding all alone in the desert under the stars, you think that God would reward you with a penthouse suite at the Clarita Hyatt Resort, right? And with an all-you-can-eat buffet. But he doesn't do that. He sends him to a brook. I mean, and worse than that, it's not gushing resources. He had to work for that water. God provided it, but then Elijah had to go down and get it. He had to go down, he had to kneel down, he had to kind of scoop up the water, he had to sift it a bit to make sure the impurities settled. I mean, you think about the food. The ravens supernaturally brought the meat, but I bet you he had to cook it, right? So you're going, well, what's your point, PG? My point is that God can do all the work for us supernaturally. But instead, for whatever reason, he chooses to partner with us. The miracles of God require a work on our part as well. It requires our partnership with God. Small as it is, God invites us into the miracles. He invites us to participate in the miracles with him. He does so supernaturally and he provides naturally. Now here's the thing. God provides. But as time goes on, the brook gets lower and lower. So imagine that the water gets muddier and muddier, and it's probably more and more work for Elijah to get it. So let me ask you a question. Do you think that it was because he was doing something wrong, the brook was getting muddier and muddier? No. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had, at this point, been nothing but obedient to God. And you think to yourself, okay, I just don't get this. I'm being obedient to God, and this is my reward, muddy water? Does that seem right to you? Does that seem... And so many of us, we think, well, I must be doing something wrong. You know, it even got worse. In fact, after some time, the brook dried up. You know, it's like, I've had these conversations with God. Wait, God, I'm doing all that you want me to do. Man, I'm sacrificing. I'm doing all the things you want me to do. And instead of things getting better, they're getting worse. How could this be your will, God? But listen, can I tell you the brook dried up because of the consequences of sin in the land? There was a drought. There was a drought because of sin. And you see, too often, you people of God, we think that somehow we are exempt from the cares of the world and the consequences of living in a sinful world. And I want to say to the person this morning who's walking in obedience and trust in God, and the brook is drying up, the bank account is diminishing, your health is failing, the relationships are drying up. Listen, these are not signs of God's anger, but the result of living in a fallen world. But take heart, because God has a plan, and He is going to use the drying brook to do something greater in your lives if you will let Him. The brook drying up is part of the discipline of a life of faith. You see, God wants to teach us to trust Him and not just His gifts. You know, over 100 years ago, author Arthur Pink wrote this. I love it. Man, I want you to hear it. He says, as a general rule, God does not for long provide for His people in the same way and by the same means, lest they should rest in them and expect help from them. Sooner or later, God shows us how dependent we are upon Himself, even for the supplies of daily mercies. But the heart of the people of God must be tested to show whether their trust is in carrot or in the living God. How often we think we're trusting in the Lord when really we're resting on comfortable circumstances. And when they become uncomfortable, how much faith have we? See, after the brook dried up, And only after the brook dried up did God say to Elijah, I want you to move. I prepared another place for you to go, and I made arrangements for your provision. I wonder if we could learn a couple of things here. How many of us sometimes we jump the gun? We look at the brook drying up and we think that we need to move because this means something is wrong, we're doing something wrong, and we need to take matters in our own hands. So we start panicking and we start running where we think there's plenty without hearing from God. We just take off for where we think there's plenty. And listen, I want you to know that sometimes God does not speak to us until the 11th hour. Just when we think we're going to die, just when we think things are at its worst, that's when God speaks. That's when he shows up. And a lot of people wonder why God does not perform the miracles of old today. I wonder if it's because we move before he can do it. We depend on our own strength instead of trusting him, and we're not experiencing the miraculous power of God at work in our lives. So listen, it is only after the brook had dried up that God tells Elijah to travel 80 miles west to Zarephath in Sidon, where there's a widow who will take care of him. And by the way, just that instruction right there would cause a lot of angst in me, okay? Because to get from Zarephath, to get from Kerith to Zarephath, Elijah has to go along roads that will now expose him. Remember, the king is looking for him. The king has sent people out to all the different places to find Elijah so that he could kill him. Zarephath is in Sidon, which is where Jezebel was from and which is the center of Baal worship, okay? And it seems like Elijah has jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. I mean, it's crazy. This can't be God, right? After all, the life of a Christ follower, is all about God keeping us safe, fed, and fat, right? That's when we know we're in the center of God's will. Just think about that. He gets to Zarephath, and now there's another problem. Come on, dang it, guys. I thought that if it's God's will, then everything just magically falls into place. All the doors open. If it's God's will, everything will just happen, right? But here's the problem. God has commanded a widow to provide for Elijah. But let me ask you a question. How was he to know who that was? You think about it. Do you ever think about the details of some of these things and not just a big, broad sweep? God says, Elijah, I got somebody in Zarephath that's going to help take care of you, right? But how does he know who that person is? Does he go in Zarephath and start asking every widow? He comes up on every lady he sees and goes, excuse me, are you the one? Well, you know what's going to happen, right? I mean, his reputation is going to get around town that there's a new player in town. So, I wonder, what's his thought processing as he's going to Zarephath? How am I going to know this? And as he enters the town, there's a woman there picking up sticks, and Elijah decides to break the ice by asking a pretty simple and easy icebreaker question. Hey, can I have some water, please? And the custom of the day was that if a stranger asked for water, good manners dictated that you would get them some. So he starts with a tried and true greeting, right? Just, hey, can I have a drink of water, please? And she's like, but of course, sir, I'd be glad to get that for you. So she turns and she walks towards the well where she's going to draw some water to give to Elijah. And that's when Elijah decides to step out of his comfort zone, right? And he goes, and can you bring me some bread too? I want you to picture it because, she's turned, she's kind of walking over to the well. All of a sudden he says, and can you bring me some bread too? And she probably stops. And she spins around. And I think there's a little bit of blazing in her eyes and unwillingness you could see. And she says, you know what? Sir, water I can give you. But I can't give you any bread. You know what? I have enough flour and oil to make one more loaf of bread for my son and I, and then we are preparing to die. Here's the thing. Water was the bare minimum. It was an accepted custom that any stranger that asked for water, you would show hospitality and give it to them. And the truth of the matter is, the water was not even hers. It was water from the city well, right? There's no real skin off her own nose, except maybe to take a little bit of time out of her schedule, to readjust her schedule a little bit. But that's all that it would take for her to bring some water to this guy. It's no big deal. She'll still accomplish what she had set out to do. But this request for food is a whole different story, because that would require a rearranging of her priorities and a radical rearranging of her schedule. It actually becomes a life and death situation. You know, when I was younger, there's a story I heard, and the story is about the barnyard animals deciding that they want to throw a party. So they get together to have a planning meeting, and Mildred, the dog, she's in charge of the meeting. So she says, all right, we need some food for the party. So pretty soon she's like, who's going to bring what? And so the cows are volunteering, we'll bring some milk, and the goats say, we got some cheese. We hope it's not bad, but, I think we can bring some cheese. The hens, they volunteer to bring eggs, and Mildred's excited because, man, this is awesome. This is turning out to be a great party. So she turns to the pigs and she says, you know what? The only thing missing is some bacon. Needless to say, the pigs were not as forthcoming in their volunteering, right? Because bacon would require a completely different level of sacrifice, right? They would have to lay their life down. And that is the position that the woman finds herself in that moment when the request went from water to bread. And think about Elijah at this moment of her refusal. It feels like failure, right? He just got rejected. He kind of stepped out of his comfort zone and asked for something, and she said no, and he could probably go, dang it, I failed. But can I tell you, for Elijah, it wasn't failure, but success. He probably thought in his head, or maybe this was the way when he was like, so what I hear you saying is that you are a widow. Okay, I get it. And I wonder how many of us, the first seeming failure would stop us from experiencing God's miraculous power at work. Oh, crud, she said no. I suck. I'm a failure. I should turn back now. Elijah, he now knows that this is a widow. Woo, we're making progress, people. Come on. Yeah. Remember, God had told him that he had spoken to what? To whom? A widow to take care of him. So Elijah didn't give up and say, you know what, oops, I made a mistake. And the seeming rejection led him to the knowledge that now I'm on the right track. I'm talking to a widow. I want to give you a couple more thoughts here real quick. I want you to know that the widow does not believe in God. She does not believe in Jehovah. She's an idol worshiper, right? But one thing we do know, the Bible tells us that God had spoken to her that this moment was coming. Believe it or not, God is speaking to those who don't yet know him. And in that moment, I believe, is when Elijah knew that this woman, the woman that God had directed him to, was this woman, that she was the one. And I want you to think about it, though. I think I would have failed the course right at this point if I were Elijah, because if the woman had said to me what she said to Elijah, you know what, I can give you water, but I can't give you bread. I have enough to make one just for me and my son, and then we're going to die. If the woman had said that to me, my response would have been a little bit different than Elijah's. I think my response would be like, ooh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Man, of course I can't have you make me food. In fact, hold on a second. I might have some old bread here on me as well. Let me give it to you. Right? And for most of us in today's world, we think that's the appropriate response. But that's not what Elijah does he? He knew that this was the woman that God had directed him to, and that God wanted her to experience something greater in her life. So he leaned in. And in order for her to experience the greater God experience, he would have to push her out of her comfort zone. And I wonder how many people would have thought that Elijah was being self-seeking and manipulative. Because, if you're not looking at this through the eyes of faith and believing that Elijah was being obedient to God, then you would definitely in the natural realm think that this guy is trying to take advantage of someone who's already in need. Listen to his crazy, brazen, bold-faced request. Hey, don't be afraid. Do what I tell you. Make the bread for me first, and then God will provide for you after that. Whew, man. Elijah has courage, right? I mean, that is some courageous obedience on Elijah's part. Why? I mean, come on, honestly, you try walking up to a complete stranger who does not know God, and you tell them that the last $20 they have in their pocket, give it to you, and the last $20 that they're now going to use to go to the store and buy some food for their starving family at home. You tell them, you know what, give it to me. Because only after you give it to me, God will take care of you. How do you think that's going to go down? And then Elijah is bold enough to start prophesying to this woman. Listen, the food will not run out as long as the drought lasts if you do what I tell you to do. If God is not in this, then this is the worst kind of manipulation possible, right? But it was only in his boldness to speak God's truth that breakthrough occurred. He didn't backpedal. He didn't apologize. He spoke out in truth. And because of that, because God had been speaking to the woman, the word of truth that he spoke in courage resonated with her. She might have called it deja vu because she didn't believe in God and God speaking to her. But I guarantee you that it resonated with her that Elijah was saying something familiar. It resonated. You know, sometimes the miracle cannot occur until you and I are bold enough to speak out the truth of God to an unbelieving world. And when we do, it resonates because God has been speaking to them about that moment. And so often we miss it because we are not courageous enough to speak the word of truth. Come on. And I want you to see, here's the woman. She has a choice to make, right? Even though she's not a believer in Jehovah, she has had a moment prior to this when God had spoken to her about this very moment. This is no surprise to her. She knew this moment was coming. But knowing it's coming and responding in obedience when the moment is upon us are two very different things, right? So which will it be? Do I give the last that I have to this man and die? Or do I have one more meal and then die? Well, she chose to obey God and give to Elijah. And well, we know the rest of the story. You can read it in 1 Kings. The food never ran out for the remainder of the famine. Man, that's crazy stuff. I want to bring this home to you as people of God for a moment, okay? I want to be Elijah in this moment. Right now, there's some of you who are experiencing a famine in some area of your life. This evening, I feel like I want to focus on two areas that you're feeling that there's a famine. But there's more. For some of you, there's more. But there are two areas that are important to us today where we feel like we're in a drought and in a famine. The first is your time. Life is so busy, and you don't have a second more for anything, and you feel harried and hapless at times. And the other is your finances. You can't seem to have enough money for the basic necessities of life. You're gathering up some sticks to make your last meal, and then all hope is gone. And then along comes PG, and he asks you to commit to something. You don't have time enough for yourself or your family, and it feels like now you've been asked to commit to some crazy thing. What's this? What's this? ITC groups? And they meet weekly? What? That's crazy. You know, I mean, I can help with a little ushering at church on Sundays or a little kids' church. That's your glass of water, and it's the accepted custom. I can give you that and still accomplish all my other schedule and priority. But what you're asking of me right now requires me changing my priorities and schedule. It requires sacrifice. It's eggs or bacon. And you're okay with giving the requisite glass of water, but now what it seems like God is speaking to you through his people is going to require sacrifice. So, if I were to come up to you personally and heard your schedule, the honest truth is, I would probably say, man, I'm so sorry for asking. That would be my normal response. But in this moment, I feel the need to be like Elijah and challenge you to give to God first. Give him the first of your time, and the same applies to your resources and finances. Give it to him first. No apologies, no backpedaling. Put him first. So many of you are okay with giving God a glass of water. It's a little work, and it's the automatic and expected response. I could fit God in on Sundays, and I don't have, as long as I don't have too much else tugging on my time, I can fit God in on Sundays. But God is asking for more. He doesn't just want the minimum response. He's asking for a sacrifice. And you have a choice to make. And I guarantee you that if you stop and take your eyes off of the circumstances, if you take your eyes off of the little that you have, you will hear the voice of God speaking to you. That what I am saying right now is resonating with what the Spirit of God has been saying to you. Listen, stop being self-centered. Stop asking, why is it always me? God, go ask somebody else. Some of you are fighting with God right now. He's prepped you for this moment that someone is going to ask a God-sized request of you. And you're willing to give a glass of water, but you're afraid to give what is really required. Don't be afraid. Do it. That same author I quoted says Christian service, ministry, is not doing something for Christ. It is doing those things which he has appointed and assigned for us. And for every single one of you, there's a resonance in your spirit right now that God has spoken to you. Come give it. Here's the result that God gives you if you will say yes. God gives you an undiminished handful. You're like, what? It's exactly what I said. God gives you an undiminished handful. It's not always superabundance. It's not that all of a sudden you get a huge amount of oil and flour. You notice that that's not what happened with the woman. It's that the oil and flour never diminishes. She didn't get a multiplied all at once amount of flour and oil for the next 3 years. But every time she gave God first, the resources never diminished. She had enough for Elijah, her son, and herself day by day. And this is what God's saying to you. He will continue to provide moment by moment for you. He wants you every day to make the choice to put Him first. Every time you see the handful and you're tempted to put you first, God says, trust me and I will multiply it. And the sad thing is too many of us are making decisions based on circumstances rather than on the command of God. We say no because we have no time instead of asking God, what do you want from me, God? Because He's not, for most of us, He's not Lord of our lives. He's just another thing we add to our schedule if we can squeeze Him in. We're giving Him the glass of water. Here, you know what, I'll give you just, take this much. I can give you a few minutes on Sunday. But I can't give you my life. I can't put you first. And we view serving Him as a scheduling issue rather than as the priority of our lives. You know what? We pay our bills first, and if there's leftovers, we consider giving Him some. We fit God in between karate and soccer practice. Heck, gym time gets more priority, right? We seek first the kingdom of Insta and Snapchat, and Fannie Mae gets our first fruits. It's the truth. Okay, some introspection time. Let me ask you some questions. How many are panicking because the brook seems to be drying up? My question is, who's your provider? The river, the ravens, or Jehovah Jireh? How many of you feel like you're obeying God and things just seem to be getting worse and you're questioning God and getting ready to jump the gun? Can I tell you, relax and rest in Him? How many of you feel that God is speaking but it can't be Him because what He's asking you to do seems worse than your current situation and therefore it cannot be God? Listen, Elijah went from civilization to solitude. Then he went from meat and bread twice a day to just bread and water for over 2 years. Why is it that we have this notion that if God is in it, then it's always going to be better? That somehow, if it seems like we go from plenty to little, then God's not in it, and what happens is we end up missing the destiny of God as a result. You know, sometimes the things of God come with great struggle. I mean, I wonder how many of you are too scared to speak God's truth and it's causing others to miss the miracle of God in their lives. Your courage to speak truth could lead a non-believer into the arms of God because He's speaking to them and you can be that confirming voice. And your courage to speak God's truth, to call another believer into holiness, could lead to spiritual breakthrough for them and for you. Be courageous. Do it. And finally, I got to ask you, how many of you are saying no to the things of God based on your circumstances rather than on what God is calling you to do, and you're missing out? Man, I want to pray for you this morning. I want to challenge you. There's so much in this passage. I just want to challenge you. I know the Holy Spirit is speaking to you about some of those areas. Don't just settle for a glass of water. Give God all first and watch Him do the most miraculous things. Lord, I just pray right now for a release of courage. I pray, Lord God, for a release of trust and obedience in the lives of your people. That, God, they would experience a greater life. They would experience breakthrough. They would experience the miraculous power of God at work because they choose to trust you. That they don't look at the circumstances or the situations, but they listen to the voice of God speaking to them. I mean, somebody's listening right now, and you're like the woman who didn't know God. You're like that woman, that widow. She had no idea who God was. But God knows about you, and He's been speaking to you. He's been drawing you to this very moment, in this very time, when some guy is going to say, listen, I want you to know God loves you, and He wants you to come into restored relationship with Him. And for somebody, that's resonating with you right now. Because God has been speaking to you. You don't even know God, but He knows you. And He loves you long before you even knew about Him. He gave His life for you. He did everything possible so that you can come back into restored relationship. And He says, all you got to do is call out to me. Believe in my Son, Jesus. And call out to me, ask me for forgiveness, and ask me to be the Lord of your life. If that's you, then would you, there's a little dialogue box that comes up in the chat that says, I want to commit my life to Christ. Or maybe you can just type it in the chat. I want to commit my life to Christ. But don't delay. Say yes to God. It's such a great, great decision to make. If you're listening on YouTube, would you just go to desertstreams.com, click on the prayer request, and let us know that you want to commit your life to Christ. We would love to pray with you and celebrate with you. Man, have a blessed week, and just say yes. Say yes to God.